Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. You've sent us a fascinating book this time, Games People Play, by Berne. It dives into the psychology of human interaction, and we're excited to uncover its insights together. Berne argues that a lot of our social interactions are actually pre-scripted games with hidden motives and payoffs.
Absolutely.
Ready to decode the games people play around you.
It's a classic for a reason. Berne's insights are just as relevant today as they were when the book was first published.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of games. What makes them different from regular conversations or activities?
Well, think about it this way. In a typical conversation, you're generally straightforward with your intentions. You're aiming for clear communication. But in these games, there's this ulterior motive driving the exchange. It's not about honest communication. It's about getting a specific psychological payoff, often at the expense of the other person.
So it's like there's this hidden agenda beneath the surface.
Exactly. And that's what makes them games. There's strategy involved, often unconsciously. Each game has a set of players, unspoken rules, and a predictable outcome.
Now, the book itself has a really interesting structure. It's broken down into 3 parts. Part 1 lays the theoretical groundwork for understanding these games. Part 2 is like a thesaurus of specific games. And Part 3 explores what lies beyond games.
That structure is really effective. Berne starts by introducing this concept called transactional analysis, which forms the foundation of his game theory.
Transactional analysis. Can you give us a quick breakdown of that?
Sure. Transactional analysis proposes that our personalities are made up of 3 ego states: the parent, the adult, and the child. And that these states influence how we interact with each other.
So are we constantly switching between these different states?
We are. And the state we're in at any given moment dictates how we communicate and respond. Think of the parent state as reflecting the attitudes and behaviors we learned from our parents or authority figures. It can be nurturing or critical. The adult is our rational, objective state, the grown-up in us. And then there's the child, which embodies our emotions, impulses, and creativity.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these states could lead to conflict, especially if they're not aligned. But how does this tie into the idea of these games?
What's fascinating is how Berne connects these ego states to the roles people take on in games. For example, you might be acting from your parent ego state, trying to control or criticize, while the other person is in their child state, feeling rebellious or victimized. That clash is often at the heart of these games.
Berne also talks about this idea of strokes as a key part of his theory. What exactly are strokes?
Strokes are essentially any active recognition we receive from others, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, positive or negative. They're the fundamental unit of social action, according to Berne. We all crave strokes, and we get them through our interactions. It's like we're all wired to seek this kind of validation from each other.
So even negative attention is considered a stroke?
Unfortunately, yes. Even negative attention can feel better than no attention at all. That's why some people might even unconsciously seek out negative strokes through playing certain games. It's a way of meeting that basic need for recognition, even if it's in a distorted or unhealthy way.
This is where things start to get really interesting. So these games, even though they're based on hidden motives and can lead to conflict, they're actually providing some kind of psychological advantage to the players.
Exactly. Games provide a sense of control, even if it's illusory. They validate pre-existing beliefs about ourselves and the world. For example, someone who believes they're always a victim might unconsciously play games that reinforce that belief. It's a way of avoiding responsibility and maintaining a familiar, even if unhealthy, dynamic.
It's almost like we get stuck in these patterns without even realizing it.
That's the danger of these games. Berne even points out that they can escalate in intensity. He describes first-degree games as socially acceptable, second-degree games as more concealed, and third-degree games as having potentially serious consequences.
Wow, that sounds intense.
Okay.
So how do we even begin to identify these games in our own lives? Where do we start?
That's where Berne's categorization of games based on where they're commonly played becomes really useful. He breaks them down into categories like life games, marital games, party games, and even consulting room games.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's dive into a specific example. One that really jumped out at me from the marital games chapter was, if it weren't for you. Or IWFY, for short. It seems like a classic example of how games can create distance in a relationship.
IWFY is a perfect illustration of a game with a clear,
Yeah.
albeit destructive, payoff. In this game, one spouse, often the wife, claims she's limited by her partner, using his restrictions as an excuse for her own lack of fulfillment or happiness.
So, for instance, she might say things like, if it weren't for you, I could have pursued my dream career. Or if it weren't for you, I'd be more social. When in reality, she's using her husband as a scapegoat
Exactly.
for her own fears or insecurities.
Precisely. It's a way of avoiding taking responsibility for her own choices
Right.
and maintaining a sense of control, even if it means sacrificing genuine intimacy.
Wow.
The husband might then play into this dynamic, perhaps unknowingly, by acting the role of the domineering spouse, further reinforcing the wife's belief that she's trapped.
Berne provides this really vivid example in the book. He describes a scenario where a wife complains that her husband restricts her social life, preventing her from learning to dance, and uses this as a justification for her own anxieties.
That scenario perfectly encapsulates the dynamic of IWFY. It's not really about the dancing, it's about avoiding the vulnerability of intimacy and maintaining the illusion of control.
But if we look deeper, it seems like the wife is actually seeking reassurance from her husband, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Reassurance that she's loved and accepted,
Absolutely.
despite her perceived limitations.
You're spot on. It's a way of testing his love,
Yeah.
but in a way that can backfire and create even more distance in the relationship.
It really highlights how analyzing these games can be so helpful in understanding our own relationships and interactions. We can start to see those patterns and ask ourselves whether they're truly serving us or holding us back from deeper connection.
It's like holding up a mirror to our interactions and seeing them with fresh eyes.
Absolutely. It's about gaining that self-awareness so we can make more conscious choices in our relationships. Now, I know we've been focusing on these games that have a negative payoff,
Right.
but Bray also talks about what he calls good games interactions that are positive and mutually beneficial.
Those are the games we want to cultivate. They're based on genuine interest, respect, and a desire for mutual growth.
Can you give us an example of a good game?
One that Berne highlights is Busman's Holiday. It's about finding joy and fulfillment in your work, even outside of your typical work setting.
Busman's Holiday. That sounds intriguing. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Imagine a teacher who spends their free time volunteering at a literacy program, or a doctor who goes on a medical mission trip. These are people who are so passionate about their work that they extend it beyond their professional obligations.
So it's about aligning your passions with your actions, even in your leisure time.
Exactly. And that genuine passion shines through. People who play Busman's Holiday are energized and inspired by their work. It doesn't feel like a chore. It feels like a calling.
That's definitely a game I can get behind.
Yeah.
But Berne does point out that even a good game can turn sour if it's not approached with authenticity, right?
That's a great point. Even with the best of intentions, ulterior motives can creep in. Let's say that doctor we mentioned goes on that medical mission trip primarily for the social recognition or to boost their ego.
Yeah.
In that case, the game becomes less about genuine service and more about self-serving motives. The focus shifts from helping others to helping oneself.
So it seems that authenticity is key here. If our actions are driven by genuine intentions, then even something like work can become a source of joy and connection, both for ourselves and for others.
Precisely. Another good game that Berne describes is Happy to Help, where people genuinely derive pleasure from helping others. It's not about getting something in return, it's about the intrinsic satisfaction of making a positive impact.
These examples of good games really offer a hopeful perspective. It suggests that we can create interactions that are both enjoyable and meaningful.
That's a key takeaway I want to emphasize. Berne's work isn't about condemning all social interactions as manipulative games. It's about becoming more aware of the dynamics at play so we can make conscious choices that lead to more fulfilling relationships. It's about recognizing when we might be engaging in a game and then consciously choosing to shift our approach.
So it's not about avoiding games altogether. It's about choosing to play games that foster connection and growth, both for ourselves and for the other players.
Exactly. It's also about recognizing those good games when we encounter them, both in ourselves and in others.
Okay, so we've talked about marital games and these fascinating good games. I'm curious to explore some of the other categories that Berne outlines. One that caught my eye was underworld games.
Oh.
These sound a bit more intense.
They do have a different flavor, that's for sure. One example from this category is cops and robbers. Now, this might sound like it only applies to criminals and law enforcement, but Berne's analysis goes much deeper. It's really about the thrill of the chase, the desire to outwit, and the fear of getting caught.
He even connects it to the childhood game of hide and seek, which I find fascinating. It's like that primal impulse to test boundaries and see if we can get away with something.
Exactly. And that impulse can linger into adulthood, sometimes manifesting in more serious ways. It might lead to actual criminal behavior.
Wow.
Or even self-sabotaging patterns where someone unconsciously sets themselves up for failure just to experience the thrill of getting caught or the relief of having their fears confirmed.
So they're almost addicted to that adrenaline rush.
Yeah.
Even if it comes with negative consequences. It's like they're playing out a real-life version of cops and robbers in their own lives.
That's a great way to put it. Berne makes this distinction between professional criminals, who are strategic and calculated, and those driven by this cops and robbers dynamic. He says these cops and robbers players are often driven by unconscious impulses, seeking a sense of excitement, even if it ultimately leads to their downfall.
It really highlights how those childhood experiences can have such a lasting impact on our behavior, even into adulthood.
It's a reminder that our past experiences shape us, often in ways we're not even aware of.
Right.
But the good news is, once we bring those patterns into consciousness, we have the power to make different choices.
Okay, so we've explored underworld games, and it seems like even those can offer valuable insights into human behavior. I'm curious to learn more about these consulting room games that Berne describes.
These are particularly interesting because they highlight how these game dynamics can show up even in a therapeutic setting. One that Berne focuses on is, quite simply, psychiatry. Now, he's careful to distinguish between psychiatry as a legitimate therapeutic process and psychiatry as a game.
So how can we tell the difference between the two?
In the game of psychiatry, the patient might unconsciously use their symptoms or therapy sessions as a way to manipulate or control the therapist.
Oh.
They might resist getting better, play the victim, or try to outsmart the therapist. It becomes less about genuine healing and more about maintaining a familiar, albeit dysfunctional dynamic.
It's almost like they're using therapy as a stage to play out their usual games.
Exactly.
Rather than a space for genuine self-exploration and growth.
Exactly. And sometimes even the therapist can get caught up in the game, perhaps unknowingly. This might happen if the therapist gets overly invested in being the healer or feels the need to fix the patient. It's important to remember that true therapy is a collaborative process, and it requires both parties to be willing to confront uncomfortable truths and challenge those ingrained patterns.
That's a crucial point. It highlights the importance of self-awareness for both the therapist and the patient. Therapy is not a magic bullet. It's an active process that requires honesty and a willingness to do the work.
Berne even suggests that, in some cases, patients might unconsciously pick up new games from their therapists. For example, they might learn to play mental health, where they focus on applying psychological principles without actually addressing their underlying issues.
It's a reminder that therapy is not about simply acquiring knowledge. It's about using that knowledge to create meaningful change in our lives.
Exactly. It's about going beyond the intellectual understanding of these concepts and putting them into practice in our daily interactions.
Okay, so consulting room games can be pretty complex. What about those indigence games that Berne mentions?
Okay.
Those seem to have broader social implications.
Indigence games highlight a complex dynamics between those who need help and those who provide it. Berne uses the example of a social worker who's dedicated to helping her clients become self-sufficient, but encounters resistance from both the clients and her supervisors.
That sounds incredibly frustrating for everyone involved.
Yeah.
What's the underlying dynamic at play in these situations?
Berne suggests that both the social worker and the clients might be unconsciously playing a game that reinforces their roles. The clients might be playing indigence as a way to secure ongoing financial assistance without having to take full responsibility for their lives. It's a way of avoiding the challenges and risks that come with true self-sufficiency.
And the social worker might be playing a complementary role. Perhaps, I'm only trying to help you, or IT for short, where they derive a sense of satisfaction and validation from their role as the rescuer, even if their efforts are ultimately enabling the client's dependence.
That's a really insightful observation. It creates this vicious cycle where the more the helper tries to help, the more the client becomes dependent, and the more the client resists help, the more the helper feels validated in their role as savior.
It's a powerful example of how these games can create a system of mutual dependence.
Yes.
Even in situations where the intentions are good.
It highlights the importance of challenging these patterns and promoting true empowerment. The social worker in this case might need to set clearer boundaries and focus on strategies that equip her clients with the tools and skills they need to become truly self-sufficient.
It's about shifting the focus from rescuing to empowering, both for the helper and the recipient.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about a game that might seem less serious but can still create a lot of social friction. Blemish.
Blemish. Okay, that one definitely rings a bell. What's the dynamic behind this game?
It's essentially the game of finding fault with others,
Right.
often focusing on trivial details. You know, the person who's always pointing out flaws in someone's appearance, possessions, or achievements. They can't just appreciate something for what it is. They have to find something to criticize.
Oh, I know the type. It's like they can't be happy for someone else's success unless they find a way to diminish it. It's almost like they're trying to knock them down a peg.
Berman suggests that blemish players are often operating from a place of insecurity. They might be projecting their own self-doubts onto others, or they might be trying to boost their own ego by putting others down. Either way, it's a defense mechanism that ultimately prevents genuine connection.
It's a good reminder for all of us to be more mindful of our own tendencies and to cultivate a more compassionate perspective, both towards ourselves and towards others.
Absolutely. And speaking of negativity, there's another game that's closely related to blemish that Berne calls Ain't It Awful?
Right.
This is the game of focusing on negativity and complaining about the state of the world.
Oh yeah, Ain't It Awful? That's a classic. It seems like you can't go to a social gathering without encountering at least one person who's determined to bring everyone down with their doom and gloom pronouncements.
It's like they derive a sense of satisfaction from focusing on everything that's wrong.
It's almost like misery loves company.
Right.
They want to validate their negativity by getting others to agree with them.
Exactly. And there's often a subtle sense of smugness in Ain't It Awful, a feeling of superiority and recognizing how bad things are.
Yeah.
But the real danger is that this game can become a habit. We get so used to focusing on the negative that we miss out on the good things in life. We become blind to opportunities and possibilities.
Berne really does offer a lot of food for thought when it comes to these games. It's like he's giving us a whole new lens through which to view our interactions.
He's providing a framework for understanding the often hidden motivations that drive our behavior
Right.
and the impact that our actions have on others.
But ultimately, I'd say his message is a hopeful one. He believes that we can break free from these patterns
Absolutely.
and create more authentic, fulfilling relationships.
Absolutely. He outlines a path towards achieving what he calls autonomy, which is characterized by self-awareness,
Okay.
spontaneity, and genuine intimacy.
Those are qualities that we can all aspire to cultivate in our relationships.
And remember, the first step towards change is awareness. By becoming more conscious of the games we play, we can choose to step out of those roles and engage in interactions that are based on genuine connection
Right.
rather than manipulation.
So what would it look like for you to be truly free from games? It's a question that Berne poses at the end of the book, and it's a powerful one to reflect on.
It challenges us to imagine a world where our interactions are driven by authenticity,
Yeah.
respect, and a genuine desire for connection.
That's a beautiful vision. And I think games people play offers a roadmap for getting there.
It's a journey worth embarking on.
It definitely is. And Berne gives us the tools to start examining those patterns and making more conscious choices. So for you listening, think about this. What games might you be playing without even realizing it?
Yeah.
What are those hidden motives driving your interactions? And are those motives ultimately leading to the kinds of connections and outcomes you truly desire?
It's a question worth pondering. And once you start to see those patterns, you can start to shift them. Berne's book is packed with insightful analysis of all sorts of games, and you're bound to recognize some of your own patterns in there.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Right.
But there are so many more fascinating games that Berne explores and games people play. I encourage you to check it out and see what insights you uncover for yourself. It's a journey of self-discovery that can be incredibly rewarding.
Remember, awareness is the first step towards change. Once you start to see those games, you can choose to play differently. You can choose to create interactions that are based on authenticity, respect, and a genuine desire for connection.
And who knows, you might even be inspired to create some new good games of your own, games that lead to growth, joy, and genuine fulfillment.
Happy decoding, everyone.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.